very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers, and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground, and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy, and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feed back into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French, and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine, and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. Let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to Australia for local insights from the WPP team. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
How well do you know Aussies? Do you know the secrets we keep and the lies we tell? That we're not as egalitarian as we think we are? Did you know a third of us weren't born here? And just 3.3% are First Nations? Do you know what we really care about? Do you get how the world views us? We're seen as a great place to live and visit, with rising cultural influence and a rich heritage, but not affordable or movers. Even though the truth is, we're a nation of innovators. We know this country inside out. We have the tools and the teams to provide the insights to power the stories that move Australians.
Hi, I'm Rose Herzeg and I'm the President of WPP Australia and New Zealand. Today I'm joined by two terrific women, Katie Riggs-Smith, Chief Strategy Officer for WPP, and Alison Tilling, Chief Strategy Officer for VMLY&R. We're talking about the latest data from the Brand Asset Valuator for the best countries, and it's going to be a really interesting discussion and hopefully a bit of a debate about what this all means for Australia. So let's look at the context first. Ali, you work with the BAV data quite a lot and you're probably closest to it across WPP. Can you tell us a little bit about the data, how it's collected, how it's collated?
Sure, absolutely. So Best Countries is an annual BAV study. I always shorten it to BAV, sorry, it's the Australian way. It's an annual brand asset valuator study that measures perceptions of 78 countries across the globe. And it does that against a range of characteristics. What's really great about those is that those characteristics are based on impressions that have the potential to drive trade, to drive travel and drive investment. And really, they directly affect brands as well. So there is some invaluable insights here. The data is gathered from consumers in each market, but also opinion leaders and business leaders as well. So we're really getting quite an interesting and big picture here.
So the interesting thing about this data is how the rest of the world sees our beautiful country, Australia. In a nutshell, Katie, what's been happening?
Well, Australia has actually dropped from 5th in the overall rankings in 2021 to 7th now, but it's not all doom and gloom because there are actually a lot of increases in the positive across some of the other factors.
And before we look more closely at the data itself, let's talk about the top 10 countries globally compared to 2021, because those winners, it's always the place where people want to start, I think. We've got new entrants into the top 10, so France and Denmark, croissants and Lego, I guess, which take out the Netherlands and New Zealand from last year's top 10. There's a bit of rearrangement at the top of the leaderboard, with Switzerland taking top spot this year. But I think, Katie, you're going to dig a bit deeper into the data for us now.
Yeah, if we look at Australia specifically, what we can see that's really interesting is that heritage, cultural influence and power are all on the rise compared to 2021. And I think that'll be an interesting one for us to talk about because there are lead indicators there for business and government. If I drill down to some of the actual specific numbers, we can see that heritage has increased from 43 to 52, which is the highest score we've had with Australia aligned to heritage. And cultural influence has increased from 45 to 59, which again is not only the highest score we've had with cultural influence, but is a really significant increase year on year and says that there's something happening within Australia that the rest of the world is starting to take notice of.
So, Katie, we've always been considered one of the youngest countries in the world, not necessarily a bad thing. What does the data tell us about what's changing when it comes to that statistic?
Well, I think what's really interesting is when you're considered a young country, it almost jars with all of those questions around heritage and cultural influence. You know, heritage by definition, of course, is the notion of traditions and landmarks that are inherited from previous generations. And so heritage has almost eluded us until now that we're actually acknowledging the land and the people that are being custodians of it, and that's gaining momentum. More and more Australians are beginning to recognise and respect that we have a unique connection with land and country that has existed over 60,000 years. And I think as a country, as we begin to look at how can First Nations knowledge and Western civilisation coexist and complement each other, that begins to have a ripple effect on the global stage. And so for me, what was really encouraging in the data was to see that traditional Western notion of heritage, you know, museums and built environments is beginning to erode, and heritage can mean something different.
And I think it's interesting that we're seeing echoes of that in how our state governments and actually different companies as well are developing new agri-tech and it's, for example, new bushfire control methods, which really kind of blend new technology with guidance from Aboriginal practice and ideas about connection to the land. And if I can just mention a really great example of that we saw recently, in Victoria, the Narrap Conservation Unit, they actually won the 2022 KPMG Indigenous Land Management Award, which is quite kind of a prestigious award in the agri-tech area. And the Narrap unit actually cares for Wurundjeri country by blending conventional environmental conservation methods and then land management methods with kind of Wurundjeri cultural practices. So there's that real kind of blend and connection between them, which I think is really interesting. And the other thing that we're seeing is increasing demand for that kind of service on the open market. So no longer is that kind of thinking and those kinds of practices reserved for Aboriginal reserves, although that's obviously really important. But we're starting to see the influence coming back the other way. And I just think that's such a positive sign for our country and commercially too.
Ali, it's really refreshing to hear that. And on that note, WPP has become a sponsor for the Australian Museum of the Burra Learning Place. It's this incredible space. It's immersive. Katie, you and I are actually at the opening ceremony, and what was so extraordinary is that this is about blending Western science with Indigenous know-how. It's probably one of the most sophisticated and interesting spaces we've ever seen. We're delighted to be a sponsor, but it really shows the way of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's nice to see that that is starting to translate in how people around the world will see Australia and our rich history. And, you know, we've got a long way to go in that, but I think even by our own admission in the last year, we are no longer young and free. We are one and free. And so these are the seemingly small but very important steps we need to take going forward.
Onto the C word, we had to mention it, we couldn't get away with it. We're talking about, obviously, COVID. It's been the biggest disruptor we've known for the last couple of years. It sounds from the results that the inability to travel to Australia has really forced a reappraisal of Australia.
Yeah, that's been interesting. And honestly, Rose and Katie, before seeing the data, I wasn't actually expecting that. it was a surprise. But I think when we were discussing it, we were saying that that might be because over the past couple of years, people have been hearing the stories and seeing the stories that we in Australia are sharing about who we are and what we do, as opposed to kind of seeing those pretty tourist photos that their friends post from their holidays, which is what might have been happening previously. And that's why we're seeing potentially some of those individual attributes like cultural influence, like culturally significant entertainment and many cultural attractions also kind of being on the rise. I think people are getting a really different view of what Australia is actually all about.
Yeah, and we also know that Tourism Australia and the individual states did a great job at keeping that desire for domestic travel alive where they could, and keeping Australia on that world stage as still being an exciting destination.
So what does this mean for our clients and for the commercial opportunities in the world? We've got this incredibly rich tapestry for Australia. How do we tap into that and what does it mean?
Well, I think that we're in a special moment right now, and I hope that we can look at this data with fresh perspectives, because what it feels like is the world is looking at us with fresh perspectives. So taking this moment in time to reconsider how we are connecting with our own audiences, how we are showcasing the people in Australia and the stories that we have, but doing that in an authentic and respectful way that's relevant to our individual clients' brands or services. So I think that there is a reappraisal of ourselves, because the world seems to be reappraising us a little bit, and making sure that we're not just going back to the status quo.
Absolutely. I think our team in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has a saying that really kind of helps with this and is the basis of their kind of cultural partnerships. They put themselves in the shoes of another culture or another people or even another brand, and they say, nothing about us without us. And I think that's a really solid foundation for commercial partnerships as well, because it gives cultures and each other, the respect that everybody deserves.
And Ali, to that point, we also know that creativity is a vital asset to any economy, particularly as you're going into a tough time. And so creativity with real power is that ability to look for connections in new things. And so I think if we can look at the data, like I said, with that fresh perspective, then we can look for that creativity and the opportunity. And if you do look at the best countries data overall and you compare it to business indicators, we can see that cultural influence is the #1 driver, not just of tourism, but of business investment decisions for a country. So it's hugely important to see this cultural influence on the rise.
Well, we've talked about a lot of the positives, but we need to remove the rose-tinted glasses for just a second. There have been some downsides to the data too. Now, we are seeing increases in heritage. You talked about the cultural influence, Katie, and the power. But we're also seeing some decreases in words and things like agility. Ali, talk to us a little bit about some of the downsides.
Absolutely. Well, I've got a bit of an Ali theory about this. I think these factors like agility and sense of movement, being a society that's kind of on the move, I think these are things that are hard to sense from across the globe when you're not actually in the market that you're thinking about, the market that you're answering questions about, when you're not able to actually directly experience that market. And I think there are also things that are harder for individual countries to tell stories about as well. So especially during times of COVID when we're not able to travel, these things are kind of harder to disseminate. So I think they might be factors that people tend to project onto other countries, the experience that they are having in their own kind of home market. So if you're in one of the other markets, like from Saudi Arabia to the USA to South Africa, and you're sensing a decline in kind of that feeling of agility, that feeling of movement in your own market, and in things in your own country, you might just project that onto answers that you're giving about other countries, particularly in this environment where we're not really able to tell as powerful stories about them and people aren't able to come and experience them. I think they're things that are harder to sense. And so that might be why we're seeing some of those declines.
Yeah, and I also think that we've mentioned the C word, the COVID word already, but I do think that everyone was critical of each other's country's approach and response to COVID, right? And our initially slow response to the vaccinations may have also impacted some of these scores around agility, etc., because that was obviously a huge talking point at the time.
So we've seen and talked about the highs and the lows for the latest BAV Best Countries data. Leaving everyone who's watching this with some proper takeouts, what's the big watch out and what's the big opportunity? And I'll start with you, Ali, and then I'll get you, Katie, to respond as well.
Absolutely. So look, I think a major opportunity that comes out of this data, particularly for clients I'm thinking about now and business opportunity, is really that how can they get involved in a meaningful way in this changed notion of heritage and this opportunity for kind of deeper cultural partnerships in Australia. The watch out I'd give is also connected to that. I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with an Aboriginal leader, actually, of a particular kind of communications consultancy, and he said something really interesting. He said, "You've got to develop trust before transaction," and I think we can get in Western kind of ways of doing business. We're pretty much like, let's focus there, let's get to the transaction, bit of small talk, get things going. And it's really kind of thinking about our own ways of doing things and really kind of paying that respect to the fact that different cultures work in different ways. And if we want real proper partnership, especially with Aboriginal First Nations people here in Australia, we do need to develop that trust and really put the effort into that before moving to transact.
Yeah, and I'd build upon that. I totally agree, Ali. I'd say that there's an opportunity, this reset, reappraisal moment to make magic and to actually inspire Australia about what it means to be Australian and how we do business in Australia and how we reflect and create communities in Australia. And so there is that opportunity for our clients to reassess the audiences, how they're talking, how they're representing, how they're supporting different communities. The watch out for me is that you have to do that with respect, authentically, and you need to research that. You need to make sure you're connecting in the right way and that it's not some superficial reset.
Well, you've heard some great insights and some great tips and tricks on how to grab an opportunity. I think that's a wrap for us. I want to thank Ali Tilling, Katie Riggs-Smith for talking about the Brand Asset Valuator Best Countries latest data. Thanks for listening.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Program Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories, such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right, that makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in a collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience. Exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the arrivals hall where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 Metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Indus Gupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.
From the start.